For those new to learning the ukulele, and often also for the more experienced player, there are certain chords that we find harder to fret than others. This is completely normal, as we're often asking of our fretting hand to form shapes and positions it's never had to do before. This video will be a part of a small series of ukulele chord tips for beginners, focusing on several of these chords and offering suggestions, options and tips to hopefully make them easier to master. For this video we'll be taking a detailed look at one of the chords we have to learn and I find people struggle with a lot, the B flat or B flat major chord. The B flat chord shape shown in the diagram is the most common fretting for the B flat or B flat major chord, and this chord shape will be very useful as you progress with your playing, as it's an easily movable chord. And by moving the same shape, one fret further up the fretboard, it gives us the standard B or B major shape, and if we were to move it all again one more fret further up, we would have another version or inversion of the C or C major chord, and so on. The chord shape we're actually playing for B flat is an A major shape as per the diagram, but we move the whole shape one fret further up the fretboard and add our first finger to replace the nut on the two strings nearest the floor, the strings that were open or unfretted for the A chord. The chord could also be fretted as a full bar chord with our first or index finger right across all four strings as per the diagram shown, which to all intents and purposes is the same shape, as fingers 2 and 3 are cancelling out the bar on the strings that they're fretting. We'll have a look into the merits of each of these options in a minute or so. The B flat chord, and in fact all major chords where there is no number after the chord name, is what is known as a triad. In other words, a chord with 3 notes in it. The notes in the B flat chord are B flat, D and F. In this B flat shape, we have the B flat note doubled on both of the outside strings, the D note on the third string from the floor, and the F on the second string from the floor. Because there are only 3 notes in the chord and we have 4 strings on our ukulele, one of the notes of the chord has to be played on 2 strings so that we can sound all 4 strings when we strum the chord. Regardless of whether you choose to play B flat as a full bar chord like the diagram shown, or this version with the partial bar just on the 2 strings nearest the floor, it still effectively needs to be treated as a bar chord, which for myself and many other players means that our thumb needs to be on the back of the neck, behind the chord if you like. Many people play most of their standard open chords with their thumb sticking up above the fretboard like so. But most people, myself included, find that when fretting bar chords, it's easier with the thumb placed on the back of the neck and allows us to add a little more pressure if needed between the first finger and thumb. You'll need to experiment with exactly where on the back of the neck your thumb feels the most comfortable. I tend to have my thumb behind the first fret and placed diagonally on the neck, like so. You could equally have your thumb directly behind your first or barring finger at the same vertical angle, or maybe behind the nut of your ukulele and pointing towards the headstock. Experiment with these different positions and let your hand guide you as to where it feels the most comfortable. All this said, some people will still find that fretting the chord is easier without their thumb on the back of the neck and just have it floating above the fretboard like so. We're all different and our hand anatomy and hence technique varies from person to person. So now let's have a look at actually fretting the chord. In an ideal world, eventually you need to be able to just put all the fretting fingers down in one motion when moving to the chord from the one before. But initially I'd suggest you building it finger by finger to start with. So in order to play the version shown, try initially placing your first finger flat across the 2 strings nearest the floor at the first fret. Using your thumb behind the neck, press down just enough that you can get those 2 strings to sound clearly if you play them individually. They should sound something like this. Then try adding your second finger to the second fret of the 3rd string from the floor. This finger, unlike our first finger, has to have enough of a curve or curl in it that it clears the 2 strings fretted by the first finger, and isn't accidentally touching either of those strings and is fretting the string with the tip of the finger. Now try to get the 3 strings fretted to sound clearly, individually. Play them together. By this point you've probably tensed up and your hand might be starting to hurt a bit because you're probably pressing down too hard. So try to relax your hand and only squeeze between the thumb and fingers enough to sound the notes of the chord. This is much easier for me to say than for you to do, as it takes practice and a lot of repetition to get comfortable with this. So at this point we should have the 3 strings nearest the floor fretted, with our first finger flat across the first 2 strings at the first fret, and our second finger ideally with a nice curve in it, fretting just the 3rd string at the 2nd fret. Finally, we need to bring our 3rd finger down to fret the string nearest our face at the 3rd fret with the tip of that finger. Again, this finger needs to have a nice curve or curl in it, the same as finger 2. So now we have our 3 fingers in a diagonal line with fingers 2 and 3 only fretting a single string each and finger 1 fretting both the strings nearest the floor. Now try and sound all the strings individually. Try and get them to ring clearly. Adjust your hand if you need to. Then try sounding them all as a chord by strumming all 4 strings. If you have any muted strings that are not sounding properly, do a visual check and see if any of your fingers are touching strings that they shouldn't be. You may also need to adjust your wrist position backwards and forwards like so, again to get the strings fretted correctly. If your hand is hurting, stop what you're doing, shake out your wrist, have a little break and then come back to it again. Practicing little and often is the way forward with learning this chord. It will take you quite some time before you can get all strings to ring clearly and it to sound right, and sometimes it will probably actually sound terrible, but persevere with it and eventually it will start to sound better the more you play. Also try to build the same chord shape by placing fingers 2 and 3 into position first and then add the first finger afterwards. Some people will find this works much better for them. Again, sound the strings individually to check for any problems and then strum the chord. In a moment we'll have a look at how to play the fully barred version of this chord and also a couple of possible cheats, but before we do, another common reason for this chord being hard to fret is due to something called the action of our ukulele. Action refers to the height of the strings from the fretboard, and this can be affected both by the height of the nut here or also by the height of the saddle here. For this chord we're trying to press down all 4 strings, which is quite possibly something you haven't tried before, and we're also trying to fret this within the first 3 frets of our ukulele, close to the nut, this plastic or bone piece here that spaces the strings. It's generally much easier to push a string down against the fretboard, further up the fretboard and towards the middle of the string, and slightly harder to do near the nut. Some ukuleles, often the less expensive ones, tend to have the height of the strings at the nut set too high, which makes the strings difficult to press down and means they will go out of tune when you play a chord. A good quick check to see if your action is too high is to place a credit card under all 4 strings, slide it up to the nut and the strings should hold that card in place. If the card is just falling out, the action of your ukulele is too high. If it does just fall out, you probably need to look into the lowering of your nut, as a high action will be making learning the ukulele much harder and some of your chords will quite possibly sound out of tune when others will sound fine. Lowering the nut is a relatively simple job and all you need is some fine sandpaper and a small dab of glue. I'm sure there are videos covering it on YouTube, or if need be you could look into finding someone who could do it for you. So back to the barred version of the B-flat chord. Like the other version, try building the chord with the first finger first by laying it across all 4 strings. You ideally don't want any of your finger joints to line up with any of the strings, as this may cause muted strings. So experiment with the barred finger placement by moving it up and down. Then try adding fingers 2 and 3, again making sure you've got a nice curl in the fingers and are fretting strings 3 and 4 with the fingertips and not touching the adjacent strings. Again, play the notes individually to check they're all ringing clearly, and then play the chord. And then also try building the chord the other way round by placing fingers 2 and 3 into position first. Then let the first or barring finger just fall onto the fretboard where it wants to land. Generally I find this method works the best for me, and then my barring finger will land slightly higher across the fretboard than I would have anticipated, but it ends up feeling more comfortable and I generally get a nice clean chord. So we now have two options of playing the same chord: the version where the finger is just fretting the two strings nearest the floor in a partial bar, or the full bar version. Try experimenting with both. I use them both regularly, and I find it often depends on the chord I'm coming from to get to B flat, or where I'm going after, that will dictate the option that I choose. Okay, I mentioned earlier that I would also give you a couple of cheat options for B flat, and these are both based on the fact that we only have 3 notes in the chord, but we have 4 strings on our ukulele. So if we were to not play one of the duplicated B flat notes on either the string nearest the floor or the 4th string nearest our face, we would still be playing a B flat chord. Now we can't just leave one of these strings unfretted, otherwise we'll end up with an extra note that shouldn't be in the chord when we strum all 4 strings. But if we were to block or mute one of these outside strings, just by gently touching it with a finger that's already fretting an adjacent string, we could then strum all 4 strings, but only effectively hear 3 of them sounding a note and 1 muted. This technique is quite common on the guitar, where we have more strings than fingers, but it can also work just as well on the ukulele. So if the X represents a blocked or muted string, we have 2 options of playing B flat, but only sounding 3 strings. The first one, and probably the easiest, would be like this. So your first finger on the 1st fret of the 2nd string, your second finger on the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, your 3rd finger on the 3rd fret of the 4th string, and then I would flatten out my first finger very slightly so that it just touches the string nearest the floor and mutes it, and then I effectively have, and if I strum that chord, I still have a B flat. So I'm only fretting strings 2, 3 and 4, and string number 1 is literally just being touched very gently by my first finger, which is fretting the 2nd string. The second option would be to fret the chord shape with my first finger covering the 2 strings near the floor, as with the normal B flat chord, my second finger to be fretting the 3rd string at the 2nd fret, but also gently touching the 4th string, but not fretting it or pushing it down. So now the 4th string, the one nearest my face, is muted, and the other 3 strings should hopefully be ringing. Again, if I strum that chord. To be honest, with this one, I find it's easier to fret the whole chord, but it gives you another option to try. So to recap, we've looked at 2 versions of playing the full 4-string B flat chord. The one with just the first 2 fingers barred, the one with the full bar, and also 2 potential cheat options where we block one of the strings. So this one where I'm blocking the string nearest the floor, and this one where I'm blocking the string nearest my face. Again, experiment with all the different options and find a shape or 2 that work best for you. So that brings us to the end of this tutorial. I will link this video to a YouTube playlist which will include other chord tip videos as and when I've posted them. If you found this tutorial helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel, as I regularly post new video tutorials for ukulele at all levels. Please give the video a thumbs up and feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions. Thank you so much for watching, and bye for now.